farming is one of the single most important factors in delivering security for Britain.
Now, the big debate question this week is, should we be taking food security more seriously in the UK? And is investing in farming the answer?
I think we will look back at those farmers who have been innovative like this and see them not just as pioneers of resiliency in our food system, but actually in society in general.
Do you think that we really are up as a sector for this change that you are thinking about? To me, it's an enormous change from where we are as a sector right now. This episode is brought to you by our headline sponsor, Virgin Money. Virgin Money's experience in agriculture goes back generations. They offer tailored financial support, including funding and loans to help you diversify, as well as solutions to manage your everyday farming finances. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Meet the Farmers, The Big Debate, the show in which we tackle the biggest issues, topics and headlines in food and farming across the UK and beyond. I'm Sophie Gregory.
And I'm Ali Hunter-Blair, and we have got another high-intensity podcast for you this week. I think we're probably asking our most important question to date, which is, should we be taking food security more seriously in the UK, and is investing in farming the answer? Now, this comes off the back of a report that has been released by the government, which is called The Global Biodiversity Loss, Ecosystem Collapse and National Security, the National Security Assessment. And it's the first time that national security has probably come back into food security as a whole. And I believe the report was only released because of a freedom of information request. So there's some quite gritty stuff in there. And we are going to be delving deep into what that means for us and how hopefully farming can be the answer to that. But we've also already done a podcast this week, haven't we, Soph?
Yes, we have. Out this week, we have another bonus episode for you. This time, we are joined by Brian Richardson and Stephen Buckham from Virgin Money for a seasonal agri-economic report in which they give their views on the agricultural sector at the moment.
And that's been really good because I got to mention robots again, which obviously has been our hot topic from last time. And the discussion has been good, hasn't it? There was a strong start from the dairy army, and then there's been some robots fighting back. But yeah, across everywhere. So the discussion has been incredible.
Yeah, people have been really engaged in this topic. And I think it's such a split topic. It's everything from animal welfare to labour to cost and what actually is the future. I mean, I've really enjoyed being involved in it, actually.
Yeah, and across all it's been amazing to see like discussion between everyone else, and also made me think more about sort of the animal welfare stuff, and also systems and people have to work, because if you don't want it to work, you won't succeed in what you do. But thank you everyone who has commented and got involved in that discussion, because it's lovely as we sit here in our relative offices and we discuss all these things. It's nice to know that people are engaged, and yeah, it's been good. So for context, we are recording this episode on the 12th of February. It will be released tomorrow on the 13th of February. And now we get on to my favourite question of the week. Sophie, where are you?
I'm actually, Ali, again, I'm at home this week. I could have convinced you otherwise with the map behind me, but I'm in my kitchen. Yeah, I have been on farm quite a lot the last 2 weeks. What have you been up to, Ali?
I can't believe that we've done 2 episodes in a row and you've been at home for both of them. I am obviously still in my office, although Annie was like, I think you need to get a podcast studio. Sophie's in different places all the time. I think you need to make it a bit like have different stuff on the wall. But yeah, I am at home too. But what's been happening on the farm? It has rained endlessly, and I know that's so farmer based, isn't it? But I saw a thing yesterday which was it has rained every day in the UK in 2026, and I can attest to that, and I imagine you can too.
It's been absolutely brutal. I mean, honestly, the amount of times I've emptied that rain gauge or it's actually just fallen off its stand because it's been so bad. I can't, it's really hard, isn't it, Ali, when you're out in the elements to keep that positivity. So hopefully we can bring some of that to the podcast today because, yeah, January and February so far have not been the most exciting months, have they?
No, well, we always, your birthday is the same, but like Annie's birthday is the end of January, and I always like see Annie's birthday as like the start start of spring almost. Then February happens and like day length gets better. And we had one sunny day last Wednesday. And actually, I posted something positive on my socials because I was like, this is great. And then from that moment onwards, it hasn't stopped raining. And like the farm is just a mess. Yeah, it is a bit depressing, although there is a little bit of sun peeking in through my window at the moment. So yeah, fingers crossed we get just a little bit of warmth on the skin, a bit of sunshine to get some positivity back into the job.
And we'll get to spring and we will forget all about January and February. That's the lucky thing about farming, isn't it? That, you know, when you hit the bottom, often those little glimmers come and you forget all about it. So yeah, very, very lucky, really. We normally would have cows out by now. So we're sort of thinking that's round the corner and getting pretty excited about that. But that also brings with it calving, which is a very busy time on the farm. So got lots to look forward to. In the news this fortnight, Ali, what story have you got?
I've got a really, really important one, and one that is very, very current. So it is Yellow Welly's Mind Your Head Week. Now, Yellow Welly's Farm Safety Foundation. They focus on all sorts of farm safety, whether that's mental health training or farm safety high vis, as you're very good at. But this year, they always pick a different topic, and this year it is suicide, which is obviously really pertinent, very hard to talk about, and they've put out a video this week, which it's a hard watch, if I'm completely honest, and that's for someone that hasn't really been at the forefront of what they're talking about. But a farmer called Sam, he set up a charity called We Are Farming Minds, which is Herefordshire based. Prince William is now the patron of it, and he is walking 142 miles from Ross-on-Wye Market to London, carrying a sack of all of farmers' worries at the moment. So whether that's loneliness, exhaustion, financial insecurity, he's just walking with it, and he has done incredibly well. I joined him actually for a mile, and that was on day one. He was flying. Absolutely flying. But he's actually raising money for the National Federation of Young Farmers Clubs. He's just, as of this moment, just hit £18,000, and actually Prince William has donated himself £5,000 to the cause. And he's had loads of support along the way. Actually, when this comes out, hopefully he will have finished his walk. But he's an incredible, incredible man who has gone through so much, but also put so much back in. And yeah, I just think it's a really feel good news story with a sort of heavy background, I guess.
I was lucky enough to meet Sam last year at a Dutchy event, and what an incredible guy he is, and so fantastic that he's had so much support with this walk. I always think actually going out and doing something is the best way to raise awareness. My news story is a bit different, to be honest. DEFRA, I don't know, some of you won't have heard, but DEFRA have awarded the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, the Allerton project, have been awarded a 4-year contract with DEFRA to deliver baseline agricultural training for government staff in England. I feel like this has been what we've kind of been asking for in some areas for a while, but it hasn't been met with great positivity in some areas. It's 650,000, which across 4 years actually is probably not a lot, but there's been some strong views on this, Ali. Have you heard much about it?
Yeah, I think we have, as farmers, screamed for a long time that the people, we always are sort of quoted saying everyone's in London, they don't actually have a clue about what's going on farm. And they have now tried to do something about that. And now we're screaming that it's a complete waste of money. And the headline is £650,000 spent on DEFRA learning about farming because they don't have a clue. Well, what do we want? There's been some arguments to say that farmers should be in DEFRA doing it, but farmers are busy people, and actually finding the people that have the time, probably not the farmers that you want in there making the decisions. So you see both sides of farming, I guess, and also you see quite a lot of negativity coming from it, even though it seems like a positive story. But and also, I guess, a little bit like all of this stuff, not all the details get released, so people run off headlines, don't they?
And I think there's probably an element of trust in there that this is actually what it's going to cost. And some people have lost their faith in sort of DEFRA. So I think some of it will be coming from that. It seems to be, it's going to cover water, crops, livestock, the whole commercial element as well. So it's covering a lot of ground. But I think where farming budgets are tight, it looks on paper like a lot of money. But like you say, let's wait and see the details more.
Yeah, the devil is always in the detail, but the people that are whinging, I would guess, will offer a different solution, and probably what they would recommend was a cheaper solution. And I guess when we've had a similar story come out yesterday as well, sort of to do with SFI budgets being slashed and SFI now going below income foregone, and you're thinking, well, have they taken that money out of the SFI pot? So then it's I think you're absolutely right. It boils back to a level of trust, which is something that needs to be sorted, I guess.
It's just around transparency and trust, isn't it? So we'll wait and see how that unfolds.
We're now going to take a short break, but when we come back, we will be talking about our big debate topic. If you run a farm or business, you know that paperwork changes faster than the weather. Case in point, HMRC's Making Tax Digital for Income Tax is arriving this April. Now, if you use profit averaging to manage those fluctuating years, there's some good news. You've likely secured a deferral until April 2027. But while that gives you some breathing space, it doesn't mean your current receipt system isn't reaching its expiration date. And that's where TELUS Farm Accounting comes in. Their software is built specifically for the unique complexities of farming, like profit averaging and seasonal cash flow. It's MTD ready, streamlines your record keeping, and makes those upcoming quarterly updates a breeze. Whether your deadline is this year or next, TELUS helps you stay compliant so you can spend less time on admin and more on farming. Get ahead of the curve at telus.com/MTD and speak to their UK-based team today. Welcome back. And now we get on to the big debate part of the episode. And I think probably the biggest question we've asked so far in our early days as podcast hosts, we're going to be asking about food security and whether we should be looking at that as a national security issue. But firstly, I'd like to welcome our guests. I'm delighted to have ffinlo Costain and Laurie Laybourn. Now, normally I would do an intro, which I usually butcher, but it would be much nicer if possibly you could give us a short intro into yourselves, maybe starting with you, Ffinlo.
Sure. I mean, I'm here primarily, I think, with my Food and Global Security Network hat on, which was a project of Farmwell, the think tank that I used to run before we then sort of pivoted and became a news channel. People probably know us as 8.9 and the Farmgate podcast. Let's get that plug in early. And so within that, we produced a report called Soil and Security just before COP26. On the basis that I think that the way that food security is framed in this country is by and large incorrect. It fails to understand the geopolitics. And actually, the report that we're about to start talking about is one of the first times that I've seen a report come out in the UK from anywhere, let alone government, that actually starts to look at those external factors in relation to the way that food is produced and supplied and the way that it impacts on the security of the nation and on the security of the planet. And I think that's quite different from food security itself.
So I run a research organisation, a think tank called the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative, and we look at what next for climate change as we head into what will be a much more challenging period as the world goes over 1.5 degrees of global heating. So I have a long experience in policymaking, particularly in the context of things like national security, and I'm calling in today from Devon, where I live rurally and spent a lot of my youth living and growing up with farmers as well. So this is a subject that's also very close to my heart personally.
Fantastic. And I'm really pleased that I got you to introduce yourselves, because that is much better than me trying to do it. The big debate question this week is, should we be taking food security more seriously in the UK? And is investing in farming the answer? Now, this is a very broad topic around UK food security, but it's come about because last month a report was released by the UK government, which was titled Global Biodiversity Loss, Ecosystem Collapse and National Security, a National Security Assessment. Now, it was a 14-page document that was released, and it was only released because of a Freedom of Information request, but it's the first time that we think that security services have been involved in launching a report into food security and how important food security can be in terms of our national security. And I guess it's looking at food in a different way, looking at food in a way that can actually protect us as a country. And that's something that we haven't really thought about for a very long time, probably since the Cold War or maybe World War II. And it's quite damning, I guess, in terms of ecosystem losses and in terms of what we eat. There's a lot of challenge in there to the way the UK produces and consumes its food. But where should we start in this? Probably start with you, Finlo, again, if that's okay.
As I say, I've been working in this area of food and security, and I separate the two very deliberately for a good 15 years or so. And I think across that time, I've spent a lot of my time trying to reframe what food security means, because I would disagree with you very slightly, Ali, in that I think that this conversation has been going on for a long time, but often from a business as usual perspective, where some within the farming industry or within the food sector have sort of argued against nature integration, have argued for bigger fields, fewer hedges, that sort of thing, on the basis that that's how you establish food security. That is the antithesis of what I believe. And what I'm interested in is the way that food scarcity or abundance impacts on civil security. And so for me, I think food security is the wrong framing. It's about food resilience and it's about food sovereignty. And what this report has done, having, dragged it by the nails out of government, and I think actually that there's been a benefit here, because if government had just put out the intelligence chief's report when it was first there, I suspect it would have been a lot longer. Because it's been thinned, it is incredibly clear. Just to go through a few of these key judgments, cascading risks of ecosystem degradation are likely to include geopolitical instability, economic insecurity, conflict, migration, increased interstate competition for resources. We're talking about water insecurity, crop yield reduction, global reduction in arable land, fisheries collapse. Quite apart from, sort of stuff that's specifically linked to climate and biodiversity. This is a hugely serious problem. I was at the final point, really, before I kind of hand back. I was at a thing at Windsor Castle a year or so back with a number of people from within the food system. We spent a couple of days looking at the issue of food security. And I think it was the first time that I'd really genuinely understood that there was such an insulated view of what food security was, that it was all about actions that we could take here without an understanding of what was actually going on elsewhere in the world.
Laurie, what are your feelings? What context does this report have for you?
I think a key bit of context is this word security, national security. So recently, off the back of the COVID experience, the UK government created an independent inquiry, the UK COVID-19 inquiry. They look at things like corrupt supply chains for PPE and so on. But the first part of it looked at how the UK government forecasted, assessed major threats, the biggest threats possible, right? Of which the pandemic turned out to be one. And that report basically said that the UK is not so good at spotting some of those big threats, particularly when they're not a result of war. And COVID, if anything, reminded us that our security, our ability to have stable systems and a stable life in this country is fundamentally interdependent on a lot of things. And it's not just things that come to try and shoot us or invade us that can lead that security to be undermined. It can also be, in the case of the pandemic, as well. So the context of this report is a moment where the government, this government, other governments around the world are thinking, hang on a minute, how can we better spot threats in this modern, scarier world that we now live in? And how, exactly as Finlo was saying, can we be more resilient in that context, right? And historically, particularly when you come to food, you had a security context in the UK that was much more geared towards conflict as the primary driver, right? Second World War, key example, our ability to feed ourselves was threatened. We had to grow as much as possible at home, and people did, in many cases, literally dig for victory when it came to improving that food resilience. We then had the Cold War, where again, there was not a direct adversary. It was no longer the Nazis who at one point were threatening to invade the country. It was the context of the Cold War, particularly the threat of nuclear war and the need to think in extremis about how we could be more resilient when it came to our ability to feed ourselves. Then the Cold War ended, and we kind of reverted back to this idea that we should allow a lot of the rest of the world to feed us in this country, right? And that created huge vulnerabilities, some of which were exposed by COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption to just-in-time supply chains and so on and so forth. And then very much in recent months, days even recently, with the wet weather and years, we have seen that those vulnerabilities also extend literally to the environment now because of disruptions caused by heat, by drought, by wet, and so on and so forth. And that is basically creating a situation where we're being reminded of the fact that our security is fundamentally dependent on the resilience of our ability to feed ourselves. So this report is really a seminal moment, I think, where the government is finally putting these bits of the jigsaw together in a way that we're already experiencing, and now at last it has been assessed properly.
I think we can't get away from how interlinked we all are now. We might be on our farms, but actually it all is linked up. Touched on COVID and wars and Farmgate there. I find it difficult sometimes to see beyond my farm gates, and that's maybe a naive point from myself. We've actually had a comment from DEFRA on the report. I'm going to read it out word for word because I don't want to get it wrong. And they've said, nature underpins our security, prosperity, and climate and resilience, and understanding the threats we face from biodiversity loss is crucial to meeting them head on. The findings of this report will inform the action we take to prepare for the future. The UK has a resilient food system and remains one of the most food secure nations in the world, producing around 65% of all the food we eat. We have access through international trade to food products that cannot be produced here, which supplements domestic production and ensures that any disruption from risks such as adverse weather or disease do not affect the UK overall security of supply. We then went back to them for another comment, and we haven't heard anything further at the time of recording. Ali, how do you feel from that comment from DEFRA?
I can already see that Laurie is itching to jump on the back of this.
I mean, there is another contradiction between that statement and the assessment itself, which is the assessment raises some pretty big questions about how the current approach to our quote-unquote food security might weather some of the shocks that we're anticipating coming up, right? So again, a bit of context here is that broadly, the approach that government has had for many years now is, look, if there's a food crisis that even reaches a global scale, which will lead to higher food prices, maybe some disrupted supply chains as well. So, security of supply is also a problem. The UK is a rich nation, still one of the richest on earth, and we will be able to buy the food that we need from the world because we will just be at the head of the queue because of the wealth of the country. And there have been questions raised about that as a policy approach for a number of years, particularly for those who have been saying, yeah, but there could be some pretty big crises on the horizon. And the COVID experience in some ways was unhelpful because it seemed to back up that government approach that at the end of the day, under duress, we'd be able to buy from whoever is selling, right? But the report, this assessment, what it says is, well, hang on a minute. We could now be facing shocks to the global food system, to global food systems of a scale that actually means that policy might break down. And one example it raises in the report is that these shocks can now be so great. For example, 2 major breadbasket regions, major food growing regions of the world could be hit simultaneously by extreme weather and severely damage their crop production, right? If that were to happen at a sufficient scale, lots of wealthy nations would be scrambling at the same time, as well as everyone else. And under those conditions, the report raises a question of whether the UK would still be able to pursue this approach of saying, look, if we get pushed up against the wall, we'll always be able to buy from those world markets. So there is a contradiction there between what that assessment is saying and then what we're hearing from DEFRA in that instance, I think.
I think what DEFRA is saying there, I mean, yeah, they're pretty fluffy words, aren't they? They sound sensible. They don't have the policies to back them up. And actually what they seem to be doing is looking backwards and saying, well, our system has worked okay to date. But the question isn't whether it's worked well to date. The question is what's going to happen in the future? And therefore, how do we need to adapt that? Because Laurie's completely right that we have this idea that we can just expand fields. We can just import. But at the time that other developed countries are experiencing similar food shortages or food supply chain pressures, at that point, food is going to become incredibly expensive. And again, with this report, we started looking at things like the impact on fertilizer supply chains, on pesticide supply chains. It doesn't even mention antibiotics and medicines and things like that. There's all kinds of reliances that we have within the system on data, on machinery, on machine parts, all kinds of bits and pieces that haven't been built into this understanding. So until we have an understanding of these supply chains within this context and how those supply chains could break down, until then, we don't really have a sense of how we need to change. And ultimately, we need to get to is an understanding. These threats take us to the point where we need to understand this is the solution. This is what we need to do in the UK, which for me is a regenerative agroecological form of agriculture with very big shake-up of the food system, the food sort of value chain itself, in order that we can then start spotting opportunities, creating jobs, creating chances for businesses to work and thrive in those areas. And just to go right back to the start of the program, when you said, what role does farming play? Farming is one of the single most important factors in delivering security for Britain and in other countries, for those other countries. But at the moment, it is incredibly poorly valued by governments of all colours, and it is incredibly poorly understood. Land use is very badly understood, and we really need to change that very rapidly.
For me, I think it's almost talking about insurance policies. The UK's arrogance, maybe, in the way that we always feel like we can buy our way out of things. And I think that's something that when it comes to national security, and as you're suggesting, COVID maybe gave us a little bit of that. But again, we probably bought our way out of it with vaccination and whatever else we needed to do, PPE going to the wrong people, whatever that was. We won't get into that debate today. But there's a lot about the fact that we sit here as a wealthy country. It takes us back to this initial food security thing. So page 10 of the report, we're talking about import of global markets. So we're talking about fertilizer, we're talking about import of food. But as you linked to there, ffinlo, we're also talking about imports of parts. Like I look at my farm machinery, a lot of it is British sourced, which is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. I feel like I can pat myself on the back, but actually it's only put together in the UK. Everything comes from elsewhere. My tractor is built in Basildon, but actually the parts are coming from Italy and all over the world, China, everywhere else. So there is, as you say, the report is it's very short and actually not short-sighted because it focuses on what it needs to focus on. But there is so much more that could happen with unrest. And I know we focus a lot on here on climate change, and a lot of our fruit and vegetables come in from places that are likely to be impacted the most by rises in temperatures. So I guess what is our problem with importing so much food? Firstly, fruit and veg nutrients that come out of that from other parts of the world. Or do I look at it from a farmer's point of view and go, you know what, 10 years time, I'll be growing bananas over here?
The question is, under the current conditions of the world, what is the most prudent strategy to be resilient, basically, right? And from the period of the end of the Cold War, probably before even that, all the way up until, beginning to approach what then became the COVID-19 pandemic, it was a uniquely stable period in human history, right? An aberration, really. We'll look back on it probably, hopefully, from a future that isn't totally falling to pieces, but being like, wow, what a kind of unique time that was. That was sort of, this sort of, golden era, however much it may not have felt like at the time. And what you're seeing in this report on page 10, if people do go to it, which is the list of the challenges the assessment identifies for UK food security, basically what you're seeing is a list of all of the things that worked in that uniquely stable period and no longer are going to work in a very volatile world. The world is becoming more volatile even before you layer in the climate change and biodiversity loss bit, right? Again, that uniquely stable period, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, and so on, was the period in which warnings about climate change and biodiversity were beginning to rise up. But the signal out of the noise of it actually impacting us hadn't yet emerged. But that's now emerging and will only get worse. And I think what this all means is that we're going to have to go back to explicitly stating what, in the jargon is called the social contract between people in society, the sort of implicit or explicit agreement between segments of our society and what the game is, basically. Let's go back to the Second World War, an example we know quite well. The game there was, look, we're going to find it quite difficult to feed ourselves in the context of the threat of Nazi invasion and the need to prosecute a global war. So here is the contract. you're going to do some rationing. We're going to grow as much food as we possibly can domestically, and we'll fill in some gaps along the way. And everyone had to play their role there, right? You had an expectation on the cost of food, the type of food, who is making that food. In the decades that have gone since, and then in that golden era of stability, we just forgot about this because the ready supply of relatively cheap food, as well as the fact that our diets changed and became dangerously unhealthy and so on and so forth, has meant that we've sort of forgotten about this idea of needing a deal between all of us about how food works. We're going to have to get that back now. And the deal is going to have to include dimensions that ffinlo was talking about, where, farmers are expected to farm in a certain way that ensures that the ecosystems that they rely on are allowed to become more resilient and to recover. But in the process, government is going to have to step up on that deal and say, look, you guys are critical to our national security, and we're going to make sure you are able to do that in a way that, doesn't require you to have started doing organic farming 30 years ago. We're going to make it actually worth your while in a way that we've not done so far. And then the general public, consumers of food, have got to understand that the prices are going to have to be different. They're going to be different anyway because of these food price shocks that are coming, and that our diets are going to have to be different as a result. And so we've got to map out that new contract between all of us to deal with the fact that that golden era of stability is now gone and will not come back.
One of the challenges that we have is that there are so many lock-ins within the system, and so we can look at democracy and the short-termism of individual governments as being one of those lock-ins. The power, the sort of corporate might of different sort of elements within the food chain and retailers, these are lock-ins. The way that the media operates, the way that politicians operate, all kinds of different things which are holding us in this kind of this sort of slightly stagnating sort of stage now. And I think in many ways, we need to kind of take a step back. I don't think anybody here is disagreeing that there is a huge challenge and that we need to do something about it. The question is what? And for me, I think we need to come back to land use. How should we be using our land? And what is our land best used to produce? And that means that we need to stop thinking about land purely from a food perspective, which I think we are in the process of doing. It's about food and it's about fiber. Most of the fiber that we have is imported into the country now, whether, for our clothes, 60% of our clothes are from petrochemicals, an awful lot of opportunity, but change that's going to be there as well. So food and fiber and nature and climate stability. And when I say stability, I'm talking about a combination of mitigation and adaptation within the land. So what can we produce as a nation? Yeah, there are always going to be luxuries. There are always going to be things that we try and import that we want to import. But how can we sort of re-establish that situation where we can essentially feed ourselves on the staples and our land is producing the things that it's able to produce and in high enough quantities that people are able to eat it, And that's about diet. Diet is, it's a big issue here. We need to change our diets. Our national diet needs to shift. How the value chain works, really need to change that. So much power held by so few at the top, where at the bottom we need to have a lot more direct sales, a lot more cooperatives, shorter supply chains, a whole range of different things there. But we also need the infrastructure, whether that's small abattoirs or small processing units for fiber and other things like that. There's a whole infrastructure piece there. And until we have a sort of a vision of what the future can and should look like, we can't develop policy and we can't bring the public on side to achieve that. And at the moment, there are lots of thoughts and different ideas and nice words, but there is no collective vision of what that future can and should look like.
This is the big thing for me that I've been talking about a lot, is I hate the phrase joined up thinking, but we've been speaking to Minette as well about, her farm profitability review, and there's lots of key points in there. The government are very good at delaying reports, as we're finding out here. They're also very good at then announcing something a little bit glossy to then sort of shelve reports and never speak about them again. And I guess that's something that we've been talking about a lot on this podcast, is that the level of trust between farmers particularly, and that's what we need to come back to here, is we want farming to be a solution, because frankly, as far as I'm concerned, I believe it can be a solution. If we want to turn this around, which we're all agreeing here as that we need to do something, because we are looking at a future where I have young children that is going to look very, very different to what we currently have now. How can we get, and I guess my question really is, who are the right people to actually implement this change? Because we have been driven as farmers by policy. We always are. We always have. When we were in the EU, we were driven by the CAP. Renette has come out with her report, which should have been released in 2016. This is something that should have been done immediately once we'd voted to leave, so that we could now be 10 years down the road. But it hasn't. It's been delayed. And we've sort of sat there with bits of policy that have come from Europe, bits of policy that haven't. We haven't had our own food strategy. And even if we have, it's been so short-sighted and so short-term that even cross-party agreed stuff like SFI isn't cross-party agreed. It's actually, we thought we liked it for a minute, but actually we don't like it. And now we're going to relaunch something that isn't quite as good. So my question, I suppose, Laurie, first is, who do we trust to produce this? Are we going to trust landowners? Are we going to trust farmers? We need governance and we need guidance, but it's just, for me as a farmer, it's really difficult to know which way I should be steered.
Yeah, which I could completely understand. I mean, it's been chaos for that, as you're alluding to there, over those last 10 years. And if you had been aware of these issues that we're talking about, resilience and looming threats, particularly from the growing environmental crisis, and you've been aware of those for longer than 10 years, you'd also have been sitting there for a long time being like, when is someone going to get to grips with this? I could say who I think ideally, in theory, would be good at that now. I think more pertinent to me is what outside events are going to force the hand of government in particular. And I think that's really what we've got to now contemplate, to comprehend. That's already happened when it comes to that old, more traditional definition of national security, of really about defense and about the threat from other states and state conflict, right? And that has led to a quite rapid reaction of the desire to increase spending on defense and so on and so forth. But in the context of that, we had some very interesting messaging from particularly Fiona Hill, who was one of the key people as a part of the UK's Strategic Defence Review, saying, look, we have to understand now in this new era that we have to remember that our resilience is all of society. And the additional thing to add to that is, yes, our resilience is not just about weaponry and about deterrence, as it was in the Cold War. When you are facing non-military or to use the jargon, non-hostile threats, then your resilience has to go beyond that, right? And that's why we're talking about food and so on. And it means that, for me, the model here is that events will start to occur that will begin to force hands. And then the key thing will be how that is understood in the moment, right? So in the future, I think, and I don't know this, of course, I can't predict the future, but we hear all the time that we're going to have a potential threat, a military threat from Russia by, 2020X into the future. I think more we need to be identifying when actually major ecosystem collapse becomes that threat, like this assessment is identifying, and then in that moment there will be a knee-jerk reaction. And the crucial thing now is to lay down the ways of thinking and contextualizing that, such that it is the right or the more productive type of knee-jerk that will actually then enable this to happen. Because however much we've got documents and reviews and other things that have been lining up, and the desperate scramble to understand what the post-EU farming settlement is in the UK, a lot of people are still living with the mindset that we are in that golden era of stability, and that is not yet ended. So more of those people will realize this as shocks rain down on us. And the crucial thing then will be who can help others make sense of that. So actually we do get the paradigm shifts in governance that we're all waiting for.
I want to bring us back to the part of the report where it talks about biodiversity. And it's probably a subject quite close to my heart, because I feel as a farmer, I feel like I'm doing quite a lot for biodiversity. And I find it difficult to read what is being written, because I think in general, and maybe it's the farmers I mix with, we feel like we are doing a lot, but maybe that's, I would like to know how we do more. I don't really know whether the farm, without stopping producing some of the food it does, can actually do any more than it is already doing.
The question Ali came in with, and the question that you're asking as well, Sophie, really is around what do I do and who should do something? And I think the answer to who should do something is very simple. It's you. And it's me, it's all of us. But people who own land, people who are working farm businesses, they have an awful lot of power. It may not feel like it, but you've got an awful lot of land. The average householder doesn't have that land, and land is really key and critical. And we're doing a live panel session with 100 farmers in a village hall in Dorset tonight. And the specific question we're addressing is, will your farm be here in 20 years? And if you can't answer that sort of positively based on the things that we've been talking about so far, bearing in mind these pressures, then you need to change what you're doing, I think. And so it's about looking at, can I produce food without fertilizer? Can I produce food without reliance on the machinery that I have now? How do I need to change? How is my grass going to grow better? How do I need to adjust my stocking rates? How do I need to think about where my food is going and who my customers are? How can I build that relationship with the community? And again, I think that comes back to understanding that diet is a key part of this, that we need to go back to mixed farming, but use the knowledge that we have now to make sure that those mixed farms are successful. We need to recreate those local supply chains, stop being quite so dependent on these big global supply chains feeding into our farms in the first place. And really, animal feed is the other sort of big issue. We really need to stop using land inefficiently to produce lots of food to feed to animals and get back to livestock that are produced on grass-based systems. So it's getting these things joined up. So the answer of who needs to be doing this is you, because your business depends on it. And the village around you, the people around you depend on it, but your business depends on it. And then just finally, I've got to go back to government, haven't I? And, government has a very poor understanding of this. As I said, it values land and it values farming and food very poorly. I agree with you that price is the thing that anybody ever talks about. Whenever I've been to parliamentary committees, it's always been somebody that's asked me about price. Prices are going to go up a bit, but actually if our diets change and we get fewer of the really expensive items, less meat, not no meat, but less meat, less dairy, more beans, more pulses, more of those sorts of things, then actually we can feed ourselves, and not just feed ourselves, but feed ourselves well, nutritionally better, healthier societies for not too much more.
It sounds idyllic, Finlo, and I would love to believe that it can happen over, quick enough that we need it to happen. And a big part of it will be knowledge exchange and transfer between farmers, because as farmers, I know we're not very good at taking advice from externally. We learn best from each other. I've seen where it's happened and become a crisis point. And actually, that was the first time I really thought about food security. I was very naive before leaving my farm gate. And we saw in 2021 in Sri Lanka, removal of fertilizer overnight and, riots on the streets reverted within 10 months. The biggest thing missing there was knowledge exchange. These people did not know how to farm without it, but do you think that we really are up as a sector for this change that you are thinking about? To me, it's an enormous change from where we are as a sector right now.
Let me say very simply on that, yes, because I think that farm businesses will depend upon it. I think it will become increasingly impossible to produce food in the way that, a lot of farmers are producing it now because of the volatility of prices around things like fertilizers, because the costs of energy. And so, a whole range of different things within there will mean that farmers are looking at finding ways of cutting those external inputs and becoming more resilient. And what we know from regenerative farming is that even if yield drops a little bit, which often, frankly, it doesn't, especially in grass-based systems. Sometimes it can even go up in things like dairy. If you are cutting those external costs, those things that you're reliant on in terms of pesticides and fertilizers, etc., if you cut those down, as long as your yield is staying more or less the same, actually you're going to be more productive and you're going to be more profitable. There's going to be more resilience in your system there. When I drive around Dorset this year, I am seeing way more cover crops than I've ever seen in the past. Instead of just seeing, for example, sheep on bare muddy fields with a bit of stubble and a few turnips, I'm seeing, kind of full turnip salad, the full herbal lay, that cover crop that's sort of supporting them in many, many places. Every year, I now see change. When, if I go back 5 or 10 years, I saw basically the same kind of farming year on year on year on year. There are still lots of problems in farming, but there's a big conversation about regenerative that's taking place. Yeah, there's some greenwash, but actually greenwash is a step on the route to understanding, because at least when there's greenwash, people are recognizing that the general public wants to see some change. So it may not be fast enough. I mean, it won't be fast enough. Let's be honest about it. But there is change, and there are an awful lot of farmers now that are delivering something regenerative or agroecological, who are supplying in shorter supply chains than they were 5 years ago, and way more than they were 10 years ago. So I feel hope when I go out and I see things like that.
From a farmer's point of view, I am particularly intrigued about the pulses argument, because I have for the last 15 years tried to grow successfully profitable pulses. They are a phenomenal part of our rotation. They are brilliant for our soils. They are a really nice, usually spring crop that we can grow. And in the right year, they grow well, but we're not getting the right years. I've tried to grow soya just as an interesting thing, obviously not GM, but tried to grow soya because homegrown protein is a huge problem in the UK. And I thought that maybe UK soya, we live in the Wye Valley, we've got asparagus all around, we've got lots of ability to, lots of heat units, complete disaster. Tried it for 5 years and I was combining in November in mud. And the pulse argument I get, and I've always believed that homegrown proteins pulses, but I can't find one that works consistently. We've tried peas, we've tried beans. Last year the beans droughted out. The year previously the peas flooded out. The pulse is interesting, and I'm actually a protein believer, but I can't find something that works.
And are you sort of largely single cropping, or are you trying to buy crop and things like that?
So we're growing a lot of cover crops, exactly as you've suggested. I suppose we have changed our farming significantly in the last 10 years. So I believe that we are doing a better job now. We've got rid of potatoes. We've increased our organic matters by 18% in 6 years. And that sounds great, but we started at the bottom. So it's always good when you put a percentage increase. It sounds a lot better than it possibly was. We're doing the right thing, but we're not more profitable. Do I think the farm, and actually your talk that you're doing tonight, Finlo, is particularly interesting. Do I think the farm will still be here in 20 years? Absolutely, I do. And I think that is the thing that drives me forward to carry on in the way that we are directed. But I'm not a more financially sustainable solution than I was 10 years ago. And that is something that I really struggle with. And it's a bit away from where this report is. But for us to be able to do all of these things, our farm businesses have to be financially sustainable. They have to be profitable, because first and foremost, we're a business. And that is something that I do struggle with. Our yields moving to regenerative farm they haven't dropped, but they haven't increased. And I'm very happy with that. I'm comfortable with that. We are spending less money. But it's a hard argument.
So your profitability is increased. Yeah.
In theory, we're more profitable, but we still are growing. I'm growing the wrong crops. If I look at it from a totally outside point of view, I am growing the crops that you say we should be growing less of, which is animal feed crops, apart from malting barley, because everyone needs beer if we're going to get to 2050. But aside from that, we are now growing animal feed crops, which are going into the chickens. And the problem is that cheap protein is always going to win out over expensive protein at the moment.
Of course it will at the moment. And this is the challenge, because again, you've got a government that's sort of working on maintaining business as usual and is looking backwards instead of forwards. How can government support that transition? How can it play a role? And how can the market and the value chain play a role as well? And from your perspective, Ali, you're selling into markets which are most profitable. That, of course you are. That's what you do. But how does that market change? And in terms of that pulse element, again, it comes back to market, and it's about looking at pulses, as I'm sure you are, as being not the main crop, but a break crop or a buy crop, or those sorts of things too. But you've got to have the support from within the supply chain, because soils and people just are out of the habit of growing and eating those things. But if you look at Hobmadod's and Josiah Meldrum and the work that he's done really over 20 or 30 years to establish that and have very close direct relationships with those farmers, he's created that business. They're working with farmers like yourself to create opportunities for you and knowledge, and that knowledge exchange that Sophie's talking about, so that there is knowledge about how and what to grow, where it fits within your rotation, and that there's a market there for it.
I'm very passionate about pulses, Finlo. That's what I think I needed to rant about it, because I really, really want them to work. And actually, this change in the way that the food that we are going to have to eat is possibly a route for that to change. I could add value to the pulses that I grow, and actually, from my personal perspective, adding value to something that we are growing is on my hit list for the next 3 or 4 years to try and add something to that. I'm very conscious of time, and I love to have a rant about farming, as you're both hearing. But I really want to look back at sort of the international element, we're looking at significant disruption to international markets as a result of ecosystem degradation. We've already touched on it, but that will put a strain on UK food security. And I guess, Laurie, what are the solutions to that international market?
We are in a situation now where the system for food security that we have in this country is now existing in a world that is very different to the one that system developed in. That's fundamentally what we've been talking about here, right? The way we farm, the incentives we're faced with when we farm, the government's response to that, how consumers, people eat food, buy it, expect it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all a product of this kind of golden era of stability, and that is definitively ended. And a crucial dimension of that is exactly what you say and what is said in this assessment, which is the international side of it is really going to start to face some volatility. I mean, it's already happening, but it's going to get much worse. And the report has this startling conclusion, which is absolutely based in evidence, which is that all ecosystems are on track for a trajectory for some type of collapse into the future, which is astonishing to comprehend, right? So I think the way to think of this is that absent a very proactive, preemptive effort, largely led by government, but with the willing support and enablement of individual farmers and all the other institutions in society that need it, we can, without that leadership, individual farms, certain companies, institutions, and so on, communities, etc., can basically get a bit of a head start to improve their own resilience, to also respond to certain incentives and desires that they have as businesses. If we look at some of those fundamental things like being able to move away from fertilizers and becoming more resilient because you have less cost, and making sure that you get less runoff because of the way you're looking after soils and so on, these are all basically ways in which you're starting to do your own bits of what will probably make up, hopefully, the new system that adapts to the new world that we're in the future, right? But there will be a period of intense volatility. It's probably already begun, where we don't yet have the leadership, in particular from government. And then hopefully that leadership will come, right? And we will get elements that, to be honest, we should have maintained from the last period where we remembered that food was critical to our national security, right? So maybe we would get back some of the networks of government-owned, research laboratories and experimental husbandry farms and agricultural research institutes that just were so useful as part of our national resilience strategy for food in the past. And we will basically have a situation where, hopefully, we're no longer basically pointing to individual farmers and saying, the onus is on you as an individual, but still existing in the current system with all its misincentives and basically with this struggle about profitability. And hopefully once that leadership comes, that enablement comes from government and other parts of society, the farmers who have been at the forefront of this in the past will be recognized for what they are, which is basically very prudent business owners who took that 20-year view that ffinlo's talking about and came up with some very smart answers to those questions. And hey presto, found themselves beginning to be set up for what will be a new system of food security, hopefully, for this country.
I think we need to be very careful not to leave things to government. And that's where, there's responsibility across the piece, from the market, from the customer, to government and public funding, which, needs to be 3 times the value that it is at the moment. There's a few people are going to argue with that on the ground. And then, the farmer and the security within those businesses as well. And so we need change, but not only here. That change needs to be everywhere at the same time, all around the world, everywhere, everything everywhere all at once. But it's an agroecological change, whether you call it regen or nature-friendly farming, whatever it happens to be. It's about getting those agroecological food systems working and in place, because if food systems collapse, people move. And one of the greatest risks in the future arising from climate change and biodiversity loss is that food systems collapse and people move because they can't feed themselves. Migration then becomes a big challenge, and conflicts sort of ensue from that.
Thanks so much, ffinlo, and Laurie as well. It is such a big topic, isn't it? I mean, I'm going to swing it back to the question in hand. Should we be taking food security more seriously in the UK, investing in farming as the answer? From my point of view, I'm feeling, ffinlo, that we actually do have some sort of opportunity here as farmers. It's very easy to feel like you don't when, small part of the whole system. But I think we need to leave this on empowerment and feel like we really can make a change, because it sounds like if we don't, we're going to be in a disaster position. It sounds like we need action today, not tomorrow. So what can you leave, Finlo? You know, farmers listening to this, we have a dynamic audience listening to this, farmers, policymakers, you know, a very mixed bag. But what can you leave us with on the opportunity here to make a difference? And then to you, Laurie, afterwards.
I think very quickly that, not all of these opportunities exist yet, but, it's about creating opportunities very often. And farmers, I think, are brilliant innovators, and they're brilliant at spotting opportunities. And if those opportunities exist, then they'll move into them. But I think the first thing that people need to do is to really question themselves about their farm system as it exists at the moment. How resilient is that? If you took away these things that we're concerned about, took away antibiotics, you took away fertilizers and pesticides, if suddenly you didn't have big machinery, how would your system fare, and how can you pivot your system, not instantly but over time, to use nature's infrastructure rather than the built infrastructure, so that we are getting to that stage where food systems are recognized, and food sovereignty is recognized as actually being part of our defensive infrastructure, because that's essentially what it is. It's part of that. But from a farmer opportunity perspective, bring down those costs, because even if your yield drops, and frankly, you and I endorse it, we're, in dairy country where there's an awful lot of set stocking, Sophie. If you're in a situation like that, you're likely to see your yield increase if you start doing a little bit more mob grazing, rotational grazing, that sort of thing. So bring down those costs, focus on your profitability, and start looking at shorter supply chains.
The main issue for a society like ours is that we have forgotten that we need resilience, basically. And the way we have conceived of that has been in very narrow areas that we remember, like war, basically. But exactly as Finlo says, there are certain things that we take for granted in our food supply, just in society generally, that are going to probably break or disappear. We got a relatively mild, though of course large-scale tragedy in the form of COVID, as a sort of a taster of what is to come. And so the question basically is: now we're in that new reality, and it's already begun. What can you, as a farmer, do to anticipate those various things? And exactly as Finlo says, if this was no longer here or this was no longer here, how resilient will we be, right? And this is a question that all society now needs to ask, because we are not used to things not being there. We've had them there for a very long time, and we're now entering an era where they may disappear. So this for me is key. And in many ways, I think we will look back at those farmers who have been innovative like this and see them not just as pioneers of resiliency in our food system, but actually in society in general, basically. The people who are at the forefront of realizing that we'd exited that golden era of stability, we were in a new world, and they will be seen as front runners across all of society for working out how we can have a much more resilient and still prosperous society, even in a world that is a much less stable place.
Oh, that's a very inspiring place to close, Laurie. I must admit, I'm feeling a lot more optimistic, because when I read the report, I almost thought, what's the point? We're going to be gone by 2050. And I read it, and I guess I read it from a farmer's perspective and went, well, we're obviously doing a terrible job, and we're obviously rubbish at what we do, and what's the point? And actually now having this conversation, it has got me off my dull step where I was thinking, well, what's the blooming point? And actually it's really nice to have both of your wisdom and see that farming is the solution. The way that we farm, yes, has to change, and the way that we consume, yes, has to change. But there is an answer there, and actually I feel much more buoyant. I'm still going to go and look for my pulse if I can find it, and I feel much more buoyant about the fact that we are a solution, and there is hope beyond 2050. So thank you to you both for making me feel happier, but also for your insight and knowledge. It's this has been a really, really fascinating chat. So thank you very, very much for your time.
Wow, Ali, where do we even start with that topic? I feel like we covered a lot of bases there. And actually, surprisingly, I was a bit worried when we first looked at this that we wouldn't be able to niggle out some opportunities and some positivity. But actually, there were some real solutions in there. What did you think?
Yeah, I guess it feels like we've scratched the surface, doesn't it, of this report. But I'm exactly the same as you there. I feel so much more content with what it is that we could possibly do as farming, and the fact that farming is a solution. When I read the report initially and started doing the research into it, I was really negative about the whole thing. And I don't know whether it was because it was a Monday and it was raining, but I didn't see an answer. I almost saw the doom of society written in front of me in 14 pages, or however many pages this report are. The way it's worded and the way it's come out is so negative. And it's a little bit like all of these reports, actually, and all the interviews we've done in the past, actually verbalizing things for me, and I've said it before, makes things make more sense. And this report makes more sense to me now that we've discussed it. And there was quite a lot of historical linking there, especially from Laurie. I was quite intrigued about that. And there is that link back to World War II, the Cold War, and obviously the COVID pandemic. And I was intrigued now to how we find solutions for the future. And I think he mentioned sort of like this, it's almost insurances, isn't it? How many things do you insure for going forward? It's the same when we have our insurance reviews. Like how many things and the likelihood of them happening do we need to insure for? And I thought that was really interesting.
There's a part of me that still gets very frustrated about the ask for more from farmers, because I don't know about you, but I still feel like I can't do much more without stopping producing food. I don't think we do more than most, but the way we farm feels like we are farming alongside nature. So when there's an ask for more, I find that difficult, because as a farmer, my primary thing in farming is to produce food. I want to do that alongside nature, but the food is the thing why I got into farming, and why I suppose I get the worth out of it. So I do find frustration in the ask for more, and actually whether there's appetite for more from farmers, I don't know. It's a big ask.
And in the report, it felt like there was no solution. Like I'm like you. I feel like we are farming with nature, and I feel like we are doing our bit, and we're trying to produce food and work with nature. Obviously, the idea is that now, instead of fighting one another, we do this more intrinsically, and we link the two together. And I think we've been doing quite a good job of that. And I think, the majority of farmers across the country are doing a good job of that. So that ask for more, when you feel whilst being berated, that's what made it really negative. But actually, it was really interesting, particularly Finlo's arguments to where he thinks that farmers can go. Having suggestions, I think that's really nice. Actually having suggestions, as opposed to just being thrown constant problems that we need to sort out. Having suggestions of solutions was a really nice little bit at the end there of what he thinks that we can do to improve the situation that we're in.
It's very easy, isn't it, for us to think on a on farm level, not outside that farm gate. But Laurie particularly touched on the international side, which I find fascinating. We are an island, and we probably are quite good at forgetting that there is a world outside of that. I think it's very easy to do, because we've got so many challenges on farm as well as opportunities. It's not just about us in England, it's about the whole global level of farming.
The net zero argument has come in, and it's losing traction in the UK, because we sit here in this international world and go, okay, well, we can do all these great things, but actually we are not part of the problem. So we can do all of the things that FfinLo has suggested in the UK, but if it isn't adopted worldwide, then it's a complete waste of time. And I think that's something I think that's probably why it's important to link national security into it, because it gives another angle for reasons to change, or for reasons to try and do things better. Because otherwise, you sit there, and we've talked about this before with the sitting in my 500 acre fort and looking out, going, well, what's the point? Why am I changing? Why am I changing my system? Why am I going to make a difference? And I think if you can link in national security, then suddenly you go, oh, okay, this is important again. And that might be a way to turn people back on to this idea that we do need to change.
Yeah. And I suppose, I was talking about Sri Lanka earlier. Those countries are the ones that are going to be most impacted by the choices probably we make in terms of climate. We're seeing it now with the rain, and we've seen a drought last year. But actually for them, this is life or death, really.
It's fascinating that a national security report can be so international, I guess, and it's trying to work out how that impacts us and how we switch ourselves back onto that, because I think there has been, and it's been reported, there has been a huge disconnect now from this net zero. I think we've almost had it shoved down our throats so much that people have gone, you know what, sod it. And I think that's a dangerous place for us to be as a first world country, one of the wealthiest in the world. As Laurie said, like, you know, we have an opportunity most times to buy ourselves out of most situations. But this is a situation we can't buy ourselves out of. And that, I think, should be terrifying. And just on the flip side of that, like, this should be way up the food chain. Like, this got released, this whole report got released because somebody asked for a freedom of information request. We're not hearing anything about it. The only people that we're hearing it from is NGOs, really. The NGOs are the only people that have actually come out with anything. It feels like this is hugely important in terms of agriculture in the next few years, and it's being put underneath the carpet a little bit.
Yeah, I agree, Ali. And maybe after hearing this podcast, maybe a few others will feel strong enough to raise this higher, because it is not going away, this problem. I mean, I've really enjoyed this debate. I was concerned about how much, you know, we could pull out of it to a farm level, but I feel like we've covered a lot of bases. I think always having actionable things is very important when we're talking about things that are so serious.
And actually, like, I say that it hasn't been picked up. It is being picked up in the press, but it's really slowly. It's page 17. It's filler, and it feels like it should be more than filler. I think that's what especially after having this conversation, especially from a farming perspective, where we can be a solution-led industry and we can be ahead of a curve. I just feel like this needs to be talked about at a higher level and more than just sat in the middle of the pages to fill some. Right. Well, that big debate done, and that has been a debate, and it has been interesting. I feel like a weight has lifted off my shoulders after talking about it, actually, from reading the initial report. We're going to move on now to something that I know Sophie is particularly excited about, and that is National Apprenticeship Week. Something that, I'll be honest, I had no idea existed. The only thing I know about apprentices is that if you want to be a plumber or an electrician, the best way is to go and do your apprenticeship and learn on the job. I didn't realize it was a thing in farming, really.
Yeah, Ali, it is, I mean, in my view, probably one of the best ways to get into farming. I mean, what's better than being able to earn and learn at the same time? You know, it's actually crazy how many apprentices there are. This year alone, 353,000 apprentices started. That's across the whole, from plumbers, electricians, but also land-based as well. And actually, interestingly, that was up 4% on last year. More females than males this year. It's the first time that's ever happened. But if we zone it into land-based, we are seeing, you know, we're only actually 1.5% of all apprenticeships. So it's not a mass number, but actually we had a bit of a dip after COVID, and that's starting to come back. But we're at an equal 50-50 girls, boys joining. What really struck me, and I don't know, you know, maybe you knew more about this, but there's actually 39 land-based colleges and universities in the UK. I mean, I can only name about 5, but maybe that's my ignorance. But they're actually looking after about 15,000 hectares of the UK land base. I mean, you know, after hearing that, what do you think, Ali? Do you think they sound like a good idea?
Yeah, well, no, I think I just didn't really, I guess I didn't realize that it was a thing in agriculture. And I don't really know why, because I particularly loved your earn and learn. That's a lovely slogan.
Been practicing that.
That's not the first time you've wheeled that out, but it's, I love the idea of it, because I think that actually I have a degree in agriculture, which I had a lovely time getting it, but I'm not sure I learned a great deal about practical farming skills. I learned more in the first 6 months of coming home to farm than I did in 3 years at university. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't change my university experience because it was great, but I learned a lot more being here, and I'm not sure if I earned as much as I learned, but I was very much. And I think from that younger age we can be so unimpressionable. And actually, I was at a school, my old school, last week, talking to them about food sustainability and about futures, and about how agriculture doesn't usually, especially if you are looking to A levels in universities, often agriculture doesn't get a look in around every other subject. So if you reduce that back down to a more diploma level sort of qualification where you can actually learn and you can be very successful, then I think it's fascinating. I wonder whether do you think it's used well in agriculture? Or there's a part of me that always worries that farmers will see it as free labour or cheap labour.
Well, it's quite interesting because that's changed quite a lot. I mean, we've had 6 apprentices through the farm now, and it's changed a lot since we first started having them. What do you think is the sort of minimum wage now? It's actually a legal requirement, minimum wage for an apprentice from 2026, April 2026. What do you think? Guess.
How old are we talking here? How people wise?
So it's actually if you're under 19 or in your first year of your apprenticeship, if you're over 19. So it could be a 30-year-old, in their first year of an apprenticeship, because don't forget these levels are everything from a level 1 through to a level 7. That can be nearly up to degree level.
I would say £10.75.
Oh, well, that would be nice. I thought you were going to go pretty low. No, £8 an hour, which actually, when we started, probably our first apprenticeship about 8 years ago, it wasn't, it was like £3.55.
Was it?
So it was really not very attractive. But now, £8 an hour at 16. It's actually quite good. I think I was earning about £3 when I was 16. But also the opportunity that you are being taught alongside, and you are being paid for the day at college that you go. And you can either do that from a day release. So we've actually got 2 apprentices at the moment. One of them goes 1 day a week, but the other goes, 5 weeks on farm and then does a whole week down at college. And it totally depends what your, preferred route is, I suppose. It depends on whether you want to, do it regularly or whether you want to take a block release. Depends on the college, how close you are, but there are lots of opportunities.
And do you approach them? Do you approach the college, or does the college approach you? Or I suppose you now have a relationship with the college.
I mean, I think we've been very lucky that the apprentices have approached us for a placement. They can't actually sign on without a placement, and that's a big part of it. And one of our apprentices came midway through hers because she was, the only employee on that farm. So she, it wasn't a very at sort of 17, it wasn't a very social environment. She was often being left to do the job on her own, which, learning wise, but also farming can be quite lonely if you're doing it solo. I mean, you touched on that before, Ali, especially if you're a people person. So moving to a bigger farm suited her, but that just came through, through a contact, and that I wasn't actually looking for someone at the time, but it just made sense. I'm turning down people because you have to have the time to give them. You can't just take them on and expect them to be another employee. I normally say 2 apprentices equal 1 employee, if that makes sense, because you are having to give them, there's health and safety around it, first aid, all of those things. You have to give them the time of day to develop them for them to then be useful to your farm. I just think apprentices in agriculture is such a useful tool for the future labour force. We always talk about struggles in labour in farming, and I just think it's probably an underutilised tool, and there probably needs to look to be more of a showcase around it and more case studies around it of success, because often these apprentices stay within the sector for a long time. So yeah, I'm excited. I mean, it's a weekly thing for us. It's not just this week as apprenticeship week, but it is an exciting, I'm glad that they're shouting about it. The NFU have done a big piece on it. And I know, the other publications, farming publications, have also drawn attention to it, but we need to keep shouting about it. And I think that brings us to a close on our episode, hopefully ending on something quite positive. If you want to look up more about agricultural apprentices, there's lots online, and approach your local farmer. You never know where the opportunities might be. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please subscribe to the show if you don't already. And just a reminder, we have a bonus episode for you out this week with Brian Richardson and Stephen Buchan from Virgin Money, in which they give their views on agriculture at the moment. Message us on socials or comment below if you're watching on YouTube, or email thebigdebate@ruralpodmedia.co.uk. Please sign up for our mailing list, link in the show notes. And thank you again to our headline sponsor, Virgin Money, because we couldn't do it without you, and our associate partners, Birketts and TELUS Agriculture Consumer Goods. Please do subscribe and share. And Ben will be with you for another episode next week, and we'll see you in a fortnight's time. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Meet the Farmers, The Big Debate. Our headline sponsor for this episode was Virgin Money, whose agricultural team has years of experience in supporting farmers up and down the UK. Meet the Farmers, The Big Debate is supported by UK top 50 law firm Birketts. Birketts expert lawyers can help you manage your estates, businesses and assets. From succession planning to environmental compliance, Birketts offer practical, tailored advice to your needs. Whether you're a landowner, farmer or agribusiness specialist, the team can support you in achieving your goals and safeguarding your future. Find out more today at www.birketts.co.uk/ag.